My name is Justina Licata, and today I'm going to be talking to you about reproductive justice. But before I do that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. Your class sounds so fascinating. I'm excited to be part of the conversation, and I'm really looking forward to our larger and somewhat in-person conversation later this week. All right, so I'm going to get started. So let me pull up this presentation. Great. So, today I'm going to be talking about reproductive justice, which is something I'm very passionate about and is important to my research, but I also think it's important to disseminate information about reproductive justice because it's very relevant today and the ways in which women's reproductive health is moving. So, before I get into exactly what is reproductive justice as a framework and a movement, I want to contextualize this history for you a bit. So, we're going to start by going back to 1983. In that year, about 1,500 African American women met at Spelman College, a historically black college in Atlanta. It's also an all-women's college, for the first national conference on black women's health. This conference gave African American women space to have conversations about their health and reproductive health, and to talk about the ways that the white-led movement was not speaking to their needs specifically. I want to read you a quote by Billie Avery, who was a really important black activist from the time. This quote is actually about the conference. She says, "They came with PhDs, MDs, welfare cards, in Mercedes and on crutches, from 7 days to 80 years old, urban, rural, gay, straight, in desperate search of themselves." I love this quote because it kind of gives you a sense of the excitement around it, but it also talks about the diverse voices that were represented at this conference, right? We can see that women of different socioeconomic status are represented, at different ages, geographical representation, and sexual identity represented, all at this one conference. And this, as I mentioned, this conference gave women the space to have important conversations, and which made them excited about the opportunity to create a movement that was specific to their needs. Ultimately, this led to the following year, the creation of the National Black Women's Health Project, which is an incredibly important organization to the founding and the start of reproductive justice, and also in the ways in which the women's health movement is going to change rapidly in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, really. So, now, I'm going to go back even further because I want to talk a little bit about why it is so crucial to discuss black women's reproductive needs separately than white women's reproductive needs. So, we're going to go all the way back to slavery. Excuse me. Okay. So, while this was the first organization to be solely focused on women's needs, black women's needs, it did not actually mark the first time black women were fighting for more reproductive freedoms, and also recognizing, they very much recognized that their reproductive needs were different than white women's reproductive needs long before the 80s. So, scholars have shown that black women have been fighting against reproductive oppression since the time of slavery. Enslaved women were a prized possession in the time of slavery because they had the potential of producing additional property for slave owners. This made enslaved women particularly at risk of being sexually violated and raped by white slave owners who potentially saw that as an opportunity to increase their property. They were also encouraged to become pregnant. Some were offered incentives, including additional food rations in exchange, or if they became pregnant. This is particularly inhumane, right? Enslaved women were seen as truly as property, and often treated like cattle in the sense that they were bred, right? This is, as I said, so very, very inhumane and also very difficult to discuss and to kind of reconcile in our brains how it could happen that way. Additionally, enslaved women's bodies were oppressed in other ways, and that brings me to this picture. This picture represents a depiction of J. Marion Sims, who is the man in the black coat, and some of his assistants and 3 enslaved women. J. Marion Sims was considered for a long time the father of gynecology, and because he made some important discoveries in that medical field, but he did that by oppressing enslaved women's bodies. He actually did experimental procedures, surgical procedures on enslaved women's bodies to make those discoveries. And often when doing that, he did not provide these women any form of painkiller. And because he believed, or he argued, that enslaved women did not feel pain like their white counterparts. This is horrifying, but also crucial into understanding the ways that Black women's bodies are still oppressed through medical racism, and that often Black women are not trusted about their pain when they claim to be in pain, right? They're not believed, and they're seen as being liars, which is very hard to completely understand, but it's important to note that this continuation of medical racism targeted at Black women's bodies is really a very long history, and is something that is based in the institution of slavery. So now I want to go a little bit more closer to the present and look at the ways that after slavery was abolished, Black women's bodies continued to be oppressed. In this time, African American women were often the target of sterilization practices. I teach often about the history of eugenics, and I could spend in fact, I have taught an entire semester course on the history of eugenics, so I want to keep this relatively brief. But the eugenics was a pseudoscience that was used to justify the sterilization of people deemed unfit for reproduction, meaning this was often targeted at women that were seen as unable to have children or raise children, and that could be many meanings, that could mean many things, right? But oftentimes it was used as a way to justify women who were living in poverty, justifies to sterilize women who were living in poverty. This happened in many, many states, but I wanted to highlight one particular state. North Carolina's Eugenics Board, which was a state-based agency that that decided who was eligible and needed to be sterilized. Between 1929 and 1974, North Carolina's Eugenics Board sterilized close to 7,600 people, the majority of which were African American women. While this particular eugenics board had some of the highest sterilization rates in the U.S., it was just one of many governmental agencies in the U.S. using sterilization procedures to remedy poverty. In 1973, a representative of the National Council of Negro Women stated this. She said, "Black women on welfare have been forced to accept sterilization practices in exchange for the continuation of relief benefits," and that could mean monetary relief benefits, "and others have been sterilized without their knowledge and or consent." That's very true. There's been some recent histories of these eugenics boards, and it showed that oftentimes women were either coerced into being sterilized by being told that they could lose their financial benefits from the state, or they were not told and they did not understand that the sterilization was a permanent form of sterilization. They often were told that they would be able to reverse the procedure later when they wanted to have children. So, although African American women across the US were experiencing these types of oppressive treatments, specifically related to their reproduction, the white-led reproductive rights movement of the 60s and 70s focused much of their attention on two particular issues: access to birth control and the right to a legal abortion. While these issues are essential, I'm not arguing against that, they're essential to a woman's right to reproductive freedom, they are limited to the needs of white middle-class women, right? This brings us back to where we started. This brings us back to the National Black Women's Health Project, because this was the first time in which there was a formal organization made committed to creating change specifically for Black women around their reproductive health. The organization was committed to creating a constituency of poor and middle class women, and they created an agenda that accurately represented all of their needs. So that's important because we can see right from the beginning of this organization, they were committed to diversifying their representation across socioeconomic statuses. They created an organizational magazine called Vital Signs, which was used to disseminate accurate information to their members and the larger African American community. The organization also inspired the creation of other women of color organizations that were dedicated to helping other marginalized communities, including, and I want to mention two, the first being in 1988, the Native American Women's Health and Education Resource Center was founded by Sharonay Satoria, who is a Native woman who has started that organization in the Dakotas. And the National Asian Women's Health Organization was started in 1993. So that brings us to 1994, when reproductive justice, the term, was coined. So let me tell you that story. In 1994, 12 Black women at a pro-choice conference in Chicago coined the term reproductive justice. The reproductive justice framework consists of three core values. First, the right to not have a child, right? The right to terminate a pregnancy, the right to an abortion. Second, the right to have a child, so the freedom from forced or coerced sterilizations. And lastly, and this one's really important to understanding reproductive justice, the right to parent a child in a safe and healthy environment. So if you look at this picture on the screen, you can see that so many different issues fall under the umbrella term reproductive justice, right? We're seeing food insecurity, we're seeing disability justice, we're seeing paid leave, right? Environmental justice, decolonialization, right? All of these things are part of the reproductive justice framework, and that's because of that last core value, right? The right to parent a child in a safe and healthy environment. So what it also is fighting for safe and healthy environments, right? Which is all inclusive and really important to the expansive way reproductive justice has broadened what it means to be discussing and fighting for reproductive rights and reproductive justice. Okay, reproductive justice merges two concepts, reproductive rights and social justice. It expands the traditional reproductive rights ideology, which, as I mentioned, centers abortion and birth control, and was considered to be too narrow and did not adequately address the needs of marginalized groups, particularly Black, Indigenous, other women of color, and trans folks. Since the mid-1990s, reproductive justice activists have fought for an array of issues, including safe, legal, and affordable abortions, access to all forms of reproductive health care, affordable child care and prenatal care, and freedom from state-sanctioned sterilizations. Because the reproductive justice framework is much more inclusive and all-encompassing, it is slowly forcing the women's movement and reproductive rights movement to broaden their agendas and ensure they are fighting for rights for all. To give you a sense of the kind of work reproductive justice activists are doing today, I wanted to highlight 5 organizations that you can look up and learn more about and are doing incredible work. So first, Sister Song. Sister Song is a women's reproductive justice collective. Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. It was started in 1997. It is probably the most notable, famous reproductive justice organization. It started as a collective of 16 other organizations that came together. And they work on a plethora of important issues. Just to name a few: Black maternal mortality, abortion access, and police brutality, and then some also more specific. So for example, in North Carolina, there was a law that women who were incarcerated that went through labor were forced to be shackled during their labor, which sometimes could lead to actually broken bones because there was a need. When women are giving birth, they need to be able to move around, right? And this was preventing them from being able to do that, so much so that it did harm women's bodies. So Sister Song was working on overturning those laws. So they're doing tons of incredible work. The second one I want to talk about is URGE, which stands for United for Reproductive and Gender Equality, and they're tackling several issues, including abortion access, sexuality education, democracy reform, economic justice, decriminalization, and immigrant justice. Ultraviolet is another that focuses on fighting sexism, particularly in the media and in the political arena. We Testify. This organization has a fantastic website. I urge you to visit. They are telling abortion stories, particularly from marginalized voices, including people of color and gender nonconforming individuals. So they're kind of broadening what the abortion story looks like. If we look at the media, movies, films, TV shows that have documented abortions, is often a young white woman, and so they're trying to diversify that image. And then lastly, Black Mamas Matter Alliance, which is a Black women-led alliance, and they are centered on advocating for Black mothers, encouraging research, building power, and shifting culture for Black maternal health, rights, and justice. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this little preview to what we're going to be discussing later in the week, and I am so thrilled to have this discussion with you, and thank you so much, and looking forward to speaking with you soon.